I'm Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101 Review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years, and today I have my special guest. He's the author of several books, no other than Mr. Richard Ayre.
Hi, Daniel.
Hello, Mr. Richard, and welcome back. As
Thank you.
usual, can you please introduce yourself?
I'm Richard Ayre. I've written several books, ranging from horror through speculative sci-fi, and with this particular book, historic crime thriller.
Hmm. Historical novel. So,
Yeah.
Mr. Richard, what is the first step in planning and writing Shadow of the Knife?
The first step was really quite a bit of research, as much as I could do. I wrote this book during COVID, so I couldn't go and do a lot of. I didn't have the time anyway, Um, it was a lot of research on the internet, a lot of research reading books about, mostly not so much about sort of the book is whether or not Jack the Ripper has returned. That's the thing. So I needed to do a little bit of research on those murders, although the book isn't really about Jack the Ripper. But most of the research was on Victorian, the East End of London, and getting my bearings on old maps and old street names and alleyways that no longer exist in London. London is completely changed since 1890, when the book is set in 1890. So a lot of it was just looking at Victorian London, trying to. Yeah, I knew a little bit about it, but I'm not an expert in any shape or form. Um, but I had an inkling of the conditions, the sort of living conditions that people had to suffer in the East End of London in those days. So that was it really. I had the idea, and then it was a lot of research to fit the idea around the sort of reality, if you like, of what it would have been like.
So, Mr. Richard, how do you develop a compelling plot for your Shadow of the Knife?
Well, the plot. I mean, the big question is: has Jack the Ripper returned? That's where I started with this novel, and I wanted to again move away from what I'd done in the past slightly. I tend to like to write different genres, which I shouldn't, because I know you're supposed to stick to one genre to be successful. But what the hell? I can write what I want. It's up to me. And so I wanted to write a historical novel. I'm a big fan of historic fiction. There's an author called, one of my favourite authors is Bernard Cornwell, who wrote the Richard Sharp books and the Last Kingdom novels, and I love that. But there's another author I really like, and I don't hear a lot about him. It's a guy called Stephen Saylor, and he has written quite a few books set in ancient Rome. And they all feature one guy, this fella called Gordianus the Finder, and he's basically he's like a private eye. He solves murders, he solves mysteries, but it's all set within the very real world of Rome, on the cusp between the going from the Senate rule, the Republic, into the Empire. And so I wanted to do something similar. I wanted to write a mystery thriller, but I wanted to set it in the past. And I chose Victorian London because I've got a sort of an interest in that dark, seedy life in that industrial period in And I set it in London because obviously I wanted to have that central question, that central theme of whether Jack the Ripper has returned or not.
So, what are some strategies in creating memorable and relatable characters in Shadow of the Knife?
I think the one thing that I've just before I came on with you, I was looking at on Amazon. People have said the characterization is they like the characterization, and I'm pleased about that because I think that's something I do try to develop. I want real-ish. I want rounded characters that people can relate to. Creating realistic characters from 130, getting on for 140 years ago is very, very difficult. This is writing historical fiction. People, their morals were different, their attitudes were different. So it's I think if I created characters who were fully of their time, they might be quite sort of reprehensible to modern standards. So I try to make them as realistic as possible, but at the same time, you have to sort of keep them in a modern setting, if you like. But I decided the one thing I tried to do in this is I sort of went down the slightly. I went down the Charles Dickens routes of having names that sort of matched the characters of the people. So, for example, one of the main characters is an inspector, a policeman called Handy, and he's called Handy because he's very handy at what he does. He's good at it. The nickname of one of the other characters is his real name is Billy Cunningham, but he gets nicknamed Curmudgeon because he's properly miserable and he's always complaining about things. So there's that there. There's the characters have a interaction. The two main characters are Handy, Jonas Handy, and a surgeon called Carter Jarman, who is an orthopedic surgeon, but he's also a sort of a known local expert on criminality and things like that. And so Handy goes to him when this body turns up on the anniversary of the first murder of the canonical 5 Jack the Ripper victims 2 years later to the day. And the two of them begin their investigation and they begin a friendship. They don't know each other and they're from different backgrounds. Handy is he's really from the gutter. He's from old Nick, the slum, and he, through luck, really, he becomes a detective. Whereas Carter is a middle-class person, but who has seen the downside of life because he sort of because of his father's gambling problems. So you've got these two different characters who work well together, and there are various other characters who work with them as well.
Very well said, Mr. Richard. So, how do you choose the right point of view of the narrative of Shadow of the Knife?
Yeah, it is. It's strange. We've talked before of A Life Eternal, and I really I enjoyed in that book writing that from a first person point of view, as if Deacon was telling his own story. But with this one, there is so much going on. I sort of fell back on my old learned response from reading James Herbert of having the main story, but then having little vignettes. Certainly with the because there are some pretty gruesome murders, as you would expect if people are thinking it may be Jack the Ripper. It's quite a dark book in that respect. Although I try not to go too far into the description. I think you have to sometimes to, if you actually look at the old photographs of the victims of Jack the Ripper, you can see how brutal and awful those murders were, especially with Mary Kelly, the last one. Absolutely, the work of an absolute madman. But and that's what I wanted to put across because basically, the they are victims of this psychopath. And it's also to do with, I was trying to make it a little bit about a little talking about trying to bring about just how horrific life must have been in the East End of London, and the chances, the very few chances that women have. I've tried to make the victims, I've tried to be as sympathetic as I possibly could, because these women are thrust into this life, and there's they had very, very little chance of being able to change the circumstances that they found themselves in, and unfortunately some of them did end up as murder victims and victims in life, really. So yeah, I mean, I just wanted to write something as realistic as I possibly could, and I tried my best to do that.
Definitely. So, what techniques did you use to build tension and suspense in Shadow of the Knife?
I think the little vignettes do that, but there is a creeping tension there throughout the book. There is a vignette of the Dark Man, I call him, and you see this person from before the book starts. The first vignette is in the 1860s, when this fella is a young man, just a teenager, really, setting out in his dark little world. And those two stories sort of run together. You have the story of the Dark Man going from the 1860s, 70s into the 80s and into 1890. We've also got running alongside that thread is the story unfolding, the investigation that that Handy and Jarman are taking part in, trying to find out who this killer is. You know, they have an idea who it is, but they're trying to prove it. On top of that, you've got the layer of the juxtaposition, if you like, of the dog poor people of the East End with the very rich society of London life as well, because there's a crossover, and it's trying to break through that that wall of the rich helping each other for various different reasons and thinking that they can get away, well, get away with murder, but getting away with things. So in that way, it's a modern sort of tale, but it's about underdogs overcoming the rich bosses. And again, I think that's where the Bernard Cornwell thing comes in. Richard Sharp always has some superior officer that he has to deal with who's a scoundrel and a cad, and he has to sort that out, and it's very difficult for Sharp because he's a junior officer in a lot of the books, and he's from the gutter as well. It's a very different all the officers are rich officers and things like that. So yeah, there's the creating the tension. I hope I have created the tension, but it is building up these threads that hurtle towards. We were talking last week about the Point of Contact, and I said I was very proud of the conclusion of Point of Contact, and this one's the same. There's a big, Victorian ending to it, but there's a big sort of violent, explosive conclusion, and both of these stories sort of meet at the end at this conclusion.
Interesting, Mr. Richard. But before we go on, we want to shout out our listeners in the United Arab Emirates. Thank you, or marhaba, shukran jazilan, United Arab Emirates, because in Dubai we got 55% audience share, Abu Dhabi at 41, Ajman at 2, and Sharjah at 1%. Again, shukran jazilan, United Arab Emirates, for supporting this podcast, because this podcast is created to empower writers, authors all over the world, like Mr. Richard Ayre. So, Mr. Richard, how do you effectively outline Shadows of the Night before you start writing?
I had an idea. I had this idea of It started off completely different, actually. It started off as a sci-fi. I was going to have basically Jack. It was going to be set in 1890, but then I was going to have Jack the Ripper somehow using a time machine to sort of jump back 2 years into the past, 2 years into the future, and killing people. And then it was almost going to be like an attempt at a steampunk type of story. But then by this point of contact was going through with Furniture, and they'd said to us, look, you should be writing a like a thriller, a proper thriller. And I kept saying, I'm not interested in these cop books. You know, they all seem to be a bit derogative to me. They all just seem to be a bit the same. But I thought I wanted to try my hand at history, writing a historical novel. So I said, well, look, I tell you what if I've got this idea? I came up with this idea. All right, what if 2 years later, so we're still in the world of Jack the Ripper, if you like, but 2 years after those killings stopped, what would happen if they started again? So it's totally fictional. There's none of this happened in the, in reality. And so I built up the story from there, and I quite quickly came up with the main character of Carter Jarman. And the people of the East End in the book, they call him, he's got a nickname, Jigsaw Jarman, because he puts people back together again. And so the book was going to be all about him, and I was going to call it Jigsaw, because it would be a puzzle that he was trying to put together, as well as a play on his nickname. But I needed a detective, because you can't just have a I wanted him a little bit, talking about other Victorian literary characters, I sort of wanted a Sherlock Holmes type character who wasn't a professional policeman, but for some reason was allowed to be investigating crimes. And so for that, I needed a detective. And so I came up with Jonas Handy. But as soon as I came up with Jonas Handy, as soon as I got his background into my head, he became it's strange. I've said this before to somebody else, but it's almost as if that character said, no, I'm not going to be a secondary character. I'm going to be just as important as the character you thought this book was going to be about. And so the two of them together actually are, it becomes almost like a cop buddy type thing. These two guys become friends. They work brilliantly together. They're from two different aspects of life. And I think once that was stuck in my head, I thought, this is quite good. What's unusual is I've got two main characters. I haven't just got one protagonist. I've actually got two. And that means they can do different things because they're very different people. Carter, like I say, he's a highly intelligent man. He can study, he can research, he can find things out. Although he can hold his own in a fight as well. He was a surgeon in the army. And then I've got Handy, who is a proper brawler, and he doesn't take any nonsense from anybody. And I just like going back to what we were talking about with the characterization, that seemed to just gel. And so the story itself, which I knew basically what I wanted it to be, flowed from there. And then with the editing back and forward with the publishers, it was a bit overly complicated when I'd done it. There was too many threads running off in all sorts of different directions. And so, again, and I've got to thank Simon. God, I've forgotten his name. How awful is that? Pete. I'm sorry if you watch this. Pete and Simon at Burning Chair. They we managed to sort of cut it down to something a little bit less frantic, but better. Tighter.
Yes, indeed. So, how do the underwriters black and stay motivated throughout the writing process of Shadow of the Knife?
Writer's block. Again, this one, just like Shadow of the Knife, it went really fast. Once I had the thread of the idea of what I wanted to do, there was a bit of, it wasn't writer's block so much, but there was a lot of, because it was quite overly complicated when I was writing it, I was going down lots of different rabbit holes and thinking, well, how are they going to get out of this? How are they going to do this? When really what I should have done was step back and said, well, actually, you don't need that because that's too complicated. Let's just simplify the whole thing. Once the editing was done, it became much faster. But again, like I say, I wrote the original version, the first sort of script of it, about 3.5, 4 months, something like that. So I was probably going for it. And obviously then it got better over possibly another 6 months by the time all the editing was done and we got the cover and things like that. But yeah, it actually, it just like Shadow of the Knife, it's sort of, yeah, we can write this quite quick, once I got started with it.
Definitely. So, how do you ensure Shadow of the Knife has a satisfying and impactful ending?
Well, again, because I'm aware that I have been criticised for the ending of Minstrel's Bargain, which we've talked about, was my very first book, and rightly so. I suppose the ending is a bit. It could have been maybe tackled a little bit better. So I do try and think, is the ending as satisfying as it can be? And for this one, it wraps everything up. But what I also wanted to do was leave it open-ended, because I would, at some point, and I have written about a third of a sequel to Shadow of the Knife, set about 9 months later. And so at some point I would really like to get back into my writing again and get that done, because I love the characters. I really like the characters. I like the interactions between them. We've talked before about, I've tried to put a little bit of humor and a little bit of banter between some of them, even though the situations they find themselves in are quite horrific. Because I just, it's real life. People make jokes and stuff, and the characters themselves. Handy is quite short-tempered, and he's a bit, and Curmudgeon's very miserable, and everybody tells him to shut up, and and then you've got Jarman at the back trying to think about what's going on, and so the characters are building up in the book, and the ending, I think, is I like the ending because there's a bit I've put in. I haven't named anybody, but Handy discovers who Jack the Ripper was, but they can't do anything about it. But I quite like that, and I don't name them. And so a friend of mine who read the book, he says, you can't leave it. You can't just write that and not say who it was, But I thought, yeah, I can do what I want. It's my book.
For
And
sure.
so, yeah, I left it open. And as I've said, I've already written a fair bit of a sequel. So I'm hoping one day I'll get that sequel.
Yes,
Written.
looking forward. Looking
Yeah.
forward for the sequel of Shadow of the Knife, Mr. Richard. So, what are some common mistakes when you are writing Shadow of the Knife?
Oh, I think there's mistakes. This is the first book, because it was my first historical novel. I wrote a little historical note at the end. And there are some things that I know to be untrue. For example, there's a scene, or there's a fair few scenes, at a match factory where matches were made. Now, in the book, there's a big steam engine powering everything. But I was more than aware that wasn't the reality of match factories. Match factories, there would just be a load of women, piecework, just putting things together by hand. There wouldn't have been a big steam engine powering anything. But I wanted that in the book. And so things like that, I've put it into the book, and I've said, I know this isn't real, and anybody who's a historian knows this isn't real. So don't come shouting at us saying that this is all a load of rubbish, not historically accurate. It's a thriller set in the past. It's not really a history book. I did try to make it as historically accurate as possible, apart from where I know I'm playing around a bit fast and loose with the reality. One person got back, and there's a bit where this woman has to read a letter that's left for her, and this reviewer said, well, the woman would be illiterate, she wouldn't be able to read. And that's possibly so, but I had done research into educational sort of parliamentary acts and things like that, so there was a chance she could read. She wouldn't be a brilliant reader, being brought up on the East End of London, but and I've also made sure that I've said it's not a book about Jack the Ripper, and it isn't, because I'm actually in a Facebook group, a Jack the Ripper group. God, and these people, they know there are so many people who are obsessed with this killer. I don't know what it is about Jack the Ripper, but there are literally, he's obviously the most well-known serial killer in history, I would argue. And so people know loads, and I've said, look, if I've made any mistakes, that's my fault. I don't pretend to be an expert on Jack the Ripper. It's why I didn't want to write about Jack the Ripper as such. I wanted that Jack the Ripper world of the dark sort of Victorian alleyways, but I wanted as much as possible. Obviously, the Ripper is mentioned because when Handy is called to this first death, he's thinking, "Oh my God, is he back? Has he turned up again? Are we going to have another spate of murderers?" It's murders. But working with Jarman, they sort of start to think, is it the same person or is it somebody different? And there are things in there as well that I've put in, and I put that in the historic note, because Jarman talks about a copycat killer, and that phrase hadn't really been used in Victorian London. I think it might have been an American phrase that in the 1940s or 50s. So you've just got to, for me, a good historical thriller is something that's, it's likely to mostly, 90% of it is true, but you've got to have a bit of artistic license to sort of play a bit fast and loose. I don't play fast and loose with history. I don't, the settings are there, the type of vehicles they used to move around in, what the alleyways possibly looked at. I've tried to describe the poverty and the deprivation by reading. There's one or two books I read about life in Victorian London, which brings that about. But at the same time, you're writing fiction that hopefully is keeping people engaged. So I didn't want to get so settled into the history that it becomes a history book. I didn't want that. I wanted an adventure book, a thriller. And I think that's what it is. I think I've pulled it off mostly.
Definitely, Mr. Richard, Shadow of the Knife. But before we go on, I'm inviting you to listen to my other podcast, Food 101, our fourth season with Chef Alessandro, one of the best executive chef in one of the five-star hotel in downtown Toronto. Please do listen. Our latest episode, we talk about one of Japanese favorite ingredients, dashi, people. Dashi. So please do listen, Food 101. So, Mr. Richard, can you please invite our listeners to support all your books?
Yes, please. If anything that you've heard here grabs your attention, go and check it out on Amazon, which is the best place to do it. You can have a look. You can have a read of some reviews. Most of them are all right, like everybody. Some of them are awful, but there you go. You can't please everybody. But there's a lot there for you. There's, as I say, there's historic fiction with Shadow of the Knife. There's A Life Eternal, which is probably got the most reviews, positive reviews, and there's blood curdling horror with Point of Contact and the trilogy books. So yeah, knock yourself out, and if anybody ever does, have a go, and if you like it, please leave a review, because it really helps everybody.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Richard Ayre, because if you support him, more books to come. We are looking forward for the sequel of Shadow of the Knife.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Richard, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Daniel.
But, people, see you soon.